Tell us about Tad Dameron.
Tad Dameron, I didn't know anything very much about him except that when Don Redman we've talked about that, when he brought the band to Denmark, and we brought the band to Europe, and they performed in Copenhagen in 1947, that big band he had with Tyree Glenn and Inez Kavanaugh and Don Byas and Peanuts Holland and all that. We've talked about that. Anyway, there was one, played a lot of standard stuff, but there was one brand new arrangement which was called For Europeans Only, and Redman introduced that as saying that it was written and arranged by a very gifted young man named Tad Dameron, okay? So that's an unusual name, so it stuck with me. Anyway, For Europeans Only actually did get recorded, not by a big band, but I think by a small group, and I think of all people it was Illinois Jacquet who recorded it. But in any case, Tad, of course, was one of the great arrangers in modern jazz in the bebop era. He did wonderful things for Dizzy's big band, Our Delight. That's one of them, which I really, that's one of my favorites of his, and had a beautiful relationship with Fats Navarro, who quite possibly was the greatest of the bebop trumpet players, short as his life was. And so Chad is a major figure, and I got to see a wonderful band that he had at the Royal Roost with Fats Navarro, and there I had two tenors, I think Charlie Rouse and oh, no, it was right. Was it Alan Eager? It's Alan Eager. The first time I went to the Royal Roost was again with the same girl. Her name was Faye, who took me to the Apollo. So we also went to the Royal Roost with a girlfriend of hers who was also very pretty. So I was at the Royal Roost. We had a table right in front between two pretty girls, one redhead and the other with black hair. So Tad, when the band got off the break, Tad came over to the table, and I don't know on what pretext he introduced himself to us, but obviously it was the girls that attracted. But I was able to tell him that I had, I was still a fairly new arrival from England. He was interested in that. But I told him that I had heard the Redman band in Copenhagen and that I remembered that they had played. And he was really thrilled by that, because that was the first one to ever tell him. I mean, he knew that that was in the band's book because he had written it especially for that. But as somebody heard, he wanted to know how it was received and how it was played. Anyway, from then on, we became friendly, and I got to know Chris Albertson. You know who Chris Albertson is? And Chris Albertson, I met really, Chris and Timmy Rosenkrantz shared an apartment which had belonged to Billie Holiday. It was on 95th Street, right next to the Thalia, and where now, a symphony space was then a movie theater also. Downstairs, it was a nice big apartment, and Timmy and Chris were they were like the odd couple. Literally, just like that. Remember that odd couple thing? They were just like that. One was neat and the other one was sloppy. But they used to have some really nice parties, and that's where I got to see Tad again. He was playing piano. They had little jams there. And at that point, Tad was hooked up with Melly Dufty, and Melly Dufty was a whole thing in herself. Bill Dufty was the guy who did Billy's autobiography. We're getting a little percussion accompaniment. So she was something else, Melly, and. Tad would come in. Tad played piano at these parties and stuff, and that's not why he was there. He was there as a guest, but he played the piano. And Melly, by then, was pretty large, but she had extraordinarily beautiful skin color. It was very white, and she would wear makeup that would emphasize that, in contrast. And she was a striking looking woman, although when she got up, she was kind of baboonish. But she was what we would nowadays call an activist. And her particular thing was she wrote for a little black journal, I forget the name of it, and she was very out for that time. She was really very outspoken on the race issue. She had known Charlie. There's a famous photo of Charlie Parker in the kitchen with the pans and pots hanging on the ceiling. Do you know that photo? That's her kitchen. That was her kitchen. Okay, so she had been married. She had been married to Freddie Bartholomew. You remember who Freddie Bartholomew was? Freddie Bartholomew came to fame in the David Copperfield movie with W.C. Fields. Anyway, that's Melly. And after, that's two guys, Freddie Bartholomew, Bill Dufty, was Tad, and it's a bit open to question whether she was good for him or not. Some people say no, because he was ailing then. What was the matter with him? I'm not sure. It turned out to be cancer, and eventually, after Melly, there was a very nice English woman who actually had been a nurse and so on, who got with him and took care of him in the last stages of his life. But where did we start with this? Oh, about Tad, was that he was an extraordinarily sensitive guy, in terms of the music. He wasn't a great piano player. He was very good harmonically. He didn't have the most wonderful, lively time, but he was very good. He was a very good accompanist, and he did beautiful things. Both he and Fats were very fond of Out of Nowhere. So he did, one thing is called Nostalgia. It's a really beautiful takeoff on what you call a contrafact, a tune based on another. And the other Out of Nowhere he did is a thing called Casbah, which he also recorded, and that was quite, Symphony Sid played that constantly. It also used voice as an instrumental element. It started out with the vocal thing. I can still hear it in my mind because I heard it so many times. Sid would play it every night, There's another topic, Symphony Sid, my God. Anyway, Tad had a moment, you know, of a little bit of limelight. He recorded for Blue Note and did some things. Casbah was actually made for Capitol, which is why Sid played it a lot, because he was getting payola from Capitol. Anyway, so Tad was, his music was kind of, it was a kind of romantic aspect of bebop, you know. So that was in tune with his personality. And he was, at one point, I think he had wanted to become a doctor, but he found that he couldn't deal with blood. You know, that was a turnoff. And he was kind of special. Those parties at Chris and Timmy's were quite memorable. Pete Brown was there once. They recorded Pete. Doug Dobell, I think, came over with a 77 label, and they recorded at that. I was at that session. It was too bad, because Pete was well past his prime then. He'd been so good when he was younger.